Quite a few things to say before our speaker starts. And the first one, just so I don't forget, is to advertise this. I did pass a few some flyers around. It's for an event that starts next Tuesday, I believe, at 5:30 to 8:30. Trying to raise awareness about the refugee crisis. Strongly encourage you to come along. It's going to be in Grand Parade. It's going to be speakers, really interesting speakers, but also some stalls and a lot of opportunities for you to participate and find out if there's stuff you can concretely do to help. So that's next Tuesday, 5:30, Grand Parade. Okay? If you need a flyer, there's one spare. Okay. My name's Anthony Leaker. I'm a lecturer here. I'm going to chair this first session. This is the first in a series of lectures organised by 3 centres. CAPE, Centre for Applied Philosophy, Politics and Ethics, run by Bob and Mark. It's also helped vaguely by the Centre, the Cluster for Transgender, what is it?
Transforming Sex and Gender.
Transforming Sex and Gender. And a centre who are in the University of Ghent, so it's pan-European, which is exciting, and one of their members is going to come and speak later on. But yeah, I just want to say, even though I'm the face of this, I'm the face of today. Bob and Ian have done almost all the work organising it, so if you enjoy it and you come to all these series, please be thankful and grateful to Bob and Ian, who work incredibly hard to make these kind of events happen. They're public events. It's not, part of the timetable, etc. So thank you to Bob and Ian. Next thing is the tradition for any of you first, if there's first just here afterwards, we go for a drink. Okay, we usually go to the Wagon and Horses. We're going to go to the Wagon and Horses tonight, but I've heard that second years slyly have organised another social at the Marlborough that you're welcome to go to too. You could come to both. You could come to the Wagon first for a bit, chat to us about serious issues, or not, and then go to the Marley and get hammered. All right? So that's the social things. Okay, now on to our speaker. Oh yeah, the other thing is that our speaker will speak for 45 minutes. And then we'll have 45 minutes of questions. And I really encourage students to ask questions, okay? Please don't think that the first couple of questions might be from staff, but your questions are much more important than theirs, all right? So please ask questions. First is especially. Okay, now on to our speaker, who I'm going to introduce. Arianne Shahvisi, not how it's written. She is a lecturer in medical ethics up at Falmer in the Brighton and Sussex Medical School. Is that correct? I'm going to read the rest. She has a doctorate in the philosophy of science from the University of Cambridge. Prior to joining the Brighton and Sussex Medical School, she worked at the University of Beirut, the American University in Beirut. And her current research spans a diverse set of topics in applied philosophy, including reproductive ethics, academic freedom, and social epistemology. So over to you, Arianne. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right at the back if I don't use the microphone? Is that okay? Good. So thank you for coming out on a weekday evening. I've got an absolutely horrible cold, so forgive me if I need to sort of blow my nose or if I'm losing my voice a bit during the talk. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about what it means to be pro-choice. I'm going to kind of bracket perhaps the debate which overshadows all other debates in this regard and not really talk about the pro-life, pro-choice debate. That's something we can visit in the Q&A if you want. But I'm going to kind of take a few things on assumption and just examine the kind of pro-choice side of things here. There's actually 2 parts to the talk. So in the first part of the talk, I'll be thinking about what pro-choice means, beyond the obvious, and what kinds of contradictions it leads us into, what kind of difficulties it leads us into. And then the second part of the talk, which I might not get to, because I might go on for too long in the first half, I'll talk a little bit about what I call choice feminism, okay? So thinking about a new form of feminism and how pro-choice sits within that and the implications of choice feminism more broadly. So feminist rhetoric then dominated by choice, okay? And those of you who engage with feminism within recent years, I've watched a kind of explosion of interest in feminism over the last 10 years or so. And feminism itself has changed, and that's partly what's responsible for that interest, but that interest has also changed feminism, if that makes sense. So, as I say, feminist rhetoric's dominated by choice, and within that, it's customary for feminists to classify themselves as pro-choice with respect to abortion, okay? And all of this comes from one of feminism's most central commitments, and that is this idea that women have the right, that people have the right to bodily autonomy, okay? And that bodily autonomy and self-determination are necessary in order to be able to enact full personhood. And now what I want to do is kind of, as I say, trouble that, and kind of look at the consequences of that, look at some of the complications of that, and argue that choice feminism fails, even by the standards it sets up for itself, and that this pro-choice rhetoric also runs into problems and is likely to run into more problems as the technologies surrounding reproduction kind of advance. So nothing too controversial or surprising, I hope, but hopefully there'll be lots to talk about in the Q&A. So 2 parts of the talk then. First part, limits of reproductive autonomy. I'll be looking at 2 challenges to pro-choice, the challenge from sex selection and the challenge from disability selection. And then I'll interrogate what choice then means in light of those 2. In the second part of the talk, which as I say I might not get to, I'll define choice feminism and look at its failures. So to start with then, the limits of reproductive autonomy. So this is looking at abortion and pro-choice. So the idea here then is that there are kind of 2 arguments that you can make in favour of the pro-choice position. One is that fetuses are not persons, okay? Another is that, and this isn't exhaustive of course, I'm kind of generalising to some extent, or that people's bodies should not be used against their will, okay? So you can use one of those or you can use both of those, all right? And this comes from a broader kind of etiquette in that we do not compel anyone, regardless of their sex, to donate the use of their body to another person, even in cases of extreme need. So a very famous paper by Judith Jarvis Thompson, which some of you may have read, talks about this famous violinist who will only stay alive if you remain hooked up to this violinist. Okay, so you're hooked up and you're sharing blood with this person, and you are required for the violinist's survival. All right. I don't really know why it has to be a famous violinist and why it can't just be a normal person. I can't remember whether she kind of explains that in the paper. But the idea is you cannot be required to remain hooked up to that person, okay? So it might be virtuous to do so, but it can't be a duty, it can't be a moral duty for you to do so. And so this right to bodily autonomy is taken by its proponents and by the law to be unrelated to the reasons you might request it, okay? So if you want to have an abortion, like any other human right, the right to bodily autonomy is kind of unconditional in a sense and inalienable, okay? So in terms of your behaviour or your motivation, that shouldn't affect your access to abortions, okay? So this is all very much a sort of consensus within feminist thought on abortion. Okay. And so why are we so concerned with abortion rights? Well, they're central to feminism because the reproductive lives of surrounding female bodies have been under surveillance and control for as long as anyone can remember. And the term pro-choice was first documented in about 1974 and then came into popular usage after that. And it was kind of in reaction to pro-life. And pro-life kind of came about during the Vietnam War when conservatives were puzzled as to why those who were kind of conscientious objectors or pacifists were kind of against war, but pro-abortion, as it were, right? Or pro-abortion rights, I should say. And they couldn't kind of see how, and so they declared themselves to be pro-life and saw that as a more consistent position. So, kind of abortion campaigners kind of came back at that. Right? If one side has declared himself to be pro-life, then you don't want to be pro-death or anti-life or anything like that. And even pro-abortion doesn't fully reflect the position. And so, pro-choice became the terminology. And choice, in a sense, kind of captures what had been denied or what has been denied to women historically. Okay? But this kind of suggestive rhetorical maneuver has actually it's taken on kind of a life of its own now. And there are various pro-choice groups whose pro-choice commitments perhaps go further than would make many of us comfortable. And one example is the British Pregnancy Advisory Service. Whereas if you read a little bit about them, you'll see that it's kind of abortion under any circumstances, which may well be the commitment that people in this room share. And to a certain extent, I share that commitment. But there are complexities to it that can't just be brushed under the carpet, okay? And that's what I'm hoping for us to look at. Okay, so a woman's right to choose, because of the technologies that are now available to us, has sort of become parents' right to select, all right? And to look at why this happens, you can kind of think about it from a consent perspective, okay? So when you give consent, that consent is not general, and it can be, it isn't, you can't move it from one person to another, okay? It's very specific in terms of a particular time, in terms of where it happens, in terms of the person that it applies to. It's very specific. And so just as people should be allowed to consent to who they have sex with, so too, you can make the argument, should people have the right to choose who resides within their bodies, okay? And so, to take a kind of silly example, suppose there's a woman who's kind of racist in her sexual preferences, okay, in terms of who she wants to have sex with, and she grants consent accordingly, okay? So she'll say no when she's being racist, and, that wouldn't invalidate that consent. Right? That's still consent that's being given and that needs to be respected, even if we think that there's something wrong that happens before the consent takes place, okay? And so, by a similar logic, it seems that whatever a woman's reasons might be for aborting the fetus, we have to respect those reasons, okay? Looking at it in terms of who she is consenting to occupying that position or that relationality, okay? So that's one way of looking at it. So the first challenge then that I want to look at is sex selection. And this came up, kind of came into public discourse a few years ago with Fiona Bruce trying to push through an amendment to ban sex-selective abortion. It failed, thankfully, because it was really racist, and it was trying to, she's obviously a pro-life campaigner, and it was trying to undermine access to abortions more generally. But people got pretty worked up about it, and there are kind of good reasons for that. So what is sex selection then? Well, you can achieve it by various different means, okay? So you can achieve it by sperm sorting. So this is where you use artificial reproductive techniques, and you just pick a sperm with an XX or with an XY set of chromosomes, okay? Or you can do pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, and this is where you have a bunch of embryos and you pick the one that's, has those chromosomes already, okay? Sorry, when I said sperm, I should have said X or Y, because obviously you haven't doubled it up yet. Anyway, regardless. Rather than XX or XY. In terms of prenatal, sorry, I'm a scientist in a previous life, so I was just like, that's wrong, better correct it. So, in terms of prenatal sex discernment plus abortion, you can then, while you're pregnant, discern the sex of your fetus and then abort it, right? So that's different to the previous one, because in the previous one it's not in your womb yet, right? Okay, it's in a test tube somewhere. And then finally, infanticide or neglect. So you can kill your child once it is born, or you can neglect it in such a way that it fails to thrive, okay? So there are various things, and the arrow is going more morally problematic by most people's, kind of intuitions, okay? So that's what sex selection is, and that's how you do it. What are the problems with it? Well, the first thing I want to point out is that it's it's kind of famed as being unique to India and China. Everybody always thinks about it as an Indian problem or a Chinese problem or a kind of problem of the other, right? And actually, US data for the last 70 years demonstrates a son preference, at least for firstborns, okay? The highest sex ratio, and I'd love to know why this is the case, I still haven't managed to work it out, is in Liechtenstein, okay, which strikes me as quite odd. So this isn't simply a global south problem. The more you dig into the research on this, the more you realise that there are quite strong preferences globally for sons, okay? And in some ways, as I say here, it's like a patriarchal bargain, right? There's no doubt that in particular important ways this world is easier to live in for men, okay? And so to some extent it just makes sense to make things easy, right? And that's across the world. So what are the problems with it then? There are various different philosophical issues. One of them is that you end up with skewed sex ratios, okay? So this is a consequentialist worry. And there's all sorts of nonsense in the literature about a shortage of wives. So you get these papers where it's shock horror. How will people get married? There won't be enough women anymore. There's even one paper which claims that there will be, I can get references for these as well, a rise in rape and violence. Okay, that's what's going to happen when there's this shortage of wives. And a reproductive crisis, okay? So you kind of see a lot of hype around this. There are slippery slope arguments. Arguments about it being the slippery slope down to designer babies. You start doing this, you end with designer babies. And those people who think that this is kind of in some way benign, designer babies are not, okay? And forms of eugenics as well. You can get arguments that come from sexism, okay? So this idea that it entrenches sex supremacy, all right? This idea that the missing girls, that many of you will have read about, right? All these girls who aren't being born in various different countries, okay? You can make an argument, a kind of commodification argument. So you can say that the children are being treated as means rather than ends in themselves, okay? That's not how you should, that's not the role you should take on as a parent and, in relation to your child. And then there's another argument which I'll look at in a moment from bad parenting. So, kind of virtue ethics argument. Parenting requires tolerance. This is not practicing tolerance, okay? And you get these horrible adverts as well if you search for it online, to assume that you're out to actually have this done, And there are companies which provide this. It's legal in the States, in most states of the States it's legal. Now the problem here is obviously the problem from sexism is more than just wronging the missing girls. You can make a kind of non-identity argument there. I mean, who are you wronging really? Because they don't exist in the end, right? So it doesn't really go through very well, that argument on the previous slide. What does go through well though is that even if you had universal daughter preference, for example, right? So even if everybody wanted to choose a daughter rather than a son, that would still be a problem, right? And the problem would be, because you might want a daughter because you might think, you might live in a place where daughters don't get educated, and you might not have the money to educate somebody. So you might think it would be cheaper to have a daughter, because I don't have to educate her if I have a daughter. So it might be that everyone starts choosing daughters, but that would be a bad reason. That would be a sexist reason for doing so. Many of the people who are, if you look at ethnographies of people who have sex-selected their offspring, many of them say they want kind of sex-varied rearing experiences, or they want sex-specific rearing experiences. So they want a child who's going to... So they'll say things like, I want a child who I can take fishing. I want a child who I can go shopping with, I want a child who will be my friend. I want a child who will look after me. And these are all kind of... and it's at that point that you realise that people really are specifying gender and not sex, right? And there's this confusion between the terms which takes place in this literature quite a lot. But in any case, what it kind of demonstrates is an intention to reinforce gender roles, okay? And that's where the harm occurs. So it's a more indirect harm, okay? So it's not about these missing girls, but there nonetheless is a really legitimate worry about sexism here. And so going back to the question we started with then, this kind of open-ended and unlimited right to choose is kind of a bit self-undermining in this case. Because what you're ending up doing is reinforcing this heteronormative matrix in choosing the sex of your child, which harms women's rights in all sorts of ways, okay? And so there's a tension there. And it seems to me that combating gender roles and biological determinism, which is what's underwriting that decision, is the more fundamental good here, okay, than granting a woman the right to choose the sex of her child. And so, you know, sex or gender selection, whatever you want to call it, whatever seems more accurate, is problematic because the terms themselves are problematic and the roles themselves are problematic. And reproductive autonomy, which is valuable to us precisely because it recovers rights for women, which they did not have traditionally, is kind of undermined when we're using it in order to reinforce sex or gender roles, okay? Does that make sense? So there's kind of a fundamental conflict there. Okay, so that's just a few thoughts on sex selection then. Some thoughts now on disability, which is a much thornier issue in lots of ways, much less clear-cut, I think, particularly in our society. I think it's less clear-cut. So it's customary at the kind of sort of standard screen that you have at about 20 weeks, I think, to screen for a whole bunch of different diseases which a fetus may, you know, it's a probability assessment, essentially, right? There's no certainty, but it is a probability assessment. It comes with risks. And these screening programs, which are rolled out within the NHS, are justified in terms of cost effectiveness, okay? So the idea, that's the general justification. There are other justifications too. So the cost of detecting an affected pregnancy is deemed, it is sort of offset against the lifetime cost of kind of paying for the care that that person will need, okay? So a kind of, there's an economic argument going on there. And there's, you know, routine screening for a whole bunch of different diseases, which is then, if the parents so wish, followed by abortion or not. But equally, if somebody is worried about a particular genetic disease, they can be screened ahead of time as well, using the method which I described earlier. So there's about 250 different additional conditions which can be screened for too. Now, it's problematic, right? It's all, on a kind of basic level, it seems problematic to start with, even if on some other level, you know, what would you all in this room do if you were in that situation, right? And those two, I think on this particular issue, those two things come apart quite quickly, actually. What you do if you're in that situation, what you think is the right thing to do. And that's why I think it needs to be kind of blown open a little bit. So it seems discriminatory. So there are certain kinds of people who are deemed not to be worth the cost of their lifetime expenditure. I have a friend with cerebral palsy, and you know, the Facebook posts that I saw around the time when some revisions were being made to the laws on this, you know, she was horrified. She kind of said, you know, I'm letting out a squeak of horror here. People want to erase people like me from the world, right? They want for people like me not to exist. And had I been born later, I may have been one of those people, right? And it also seems kind of arbitrary or even pernicious in the sense that we screen for what we are able to screen for. So what science has made available to us. Okay, that's the kind of arbitrary side of it. But also, I mean, who knows what science could actually give us in that regard. We screen for what the government or the medical establishment deems appropriate in accordance with their own agendas, okay? And that's kind of harder to work out what exactly is going on there. It's also kind of demeaning and it's really sinister in the sense that those born with screen conditions could quite reasonably find this very insulting, and that goes back to the first point as well. But worryingly, they may find, going into the future, reduced levels of support as selection against their condition becomes normalised, okay? And again, we have these slippery slope arguments to worry about, as we did with sex selection. Where does this end? You know, this worry about designer babies. And again, worries about upsetting genetic ratios in the population. Genetics is very, very complex. If we start selecting, what is the gene pool going to look like? Okay, you might not be worried about that. Genes aren't so important as, you know, as most scientists think, right? but nonetheless there could be unpredictable effects. And there's a strong ideological component going back to that, which is that offering this is emphasizing this view that genes are extraordinarily important. Okay, and so it's overemphasizing that and underemphasizing the social, which we all know is hugely determinative of the people we are. Okay, and there is, much more so in a way than sex selection even, there is a really, really important tension going on here. And this one maybe is not as easily resolvable. So feminists endorse this unconditional right to abortion services, okay? That's kind of fundamental for most feminists, right? You need an abortion, you get an abortion, okay? Disability rights activists, many of whom are feminists, okay, the other way around, right? There's a huge overlap here. Object to this form of, weak eugenics, okay, which is what it is. And so you've got this kind of tension there. How do you approach that? How do you begin to resolve it? Because as I've said, abortion is essentially unconditional within the legal time constraints, okay? In all cases, whatever your reason is, the pregnancy is an unwanted pregnancy. Nothing else needs to be known about it. It's an unwanted pregnancy, all right? And of course, there are these huge epistemic challenges to that. Even if you were allowed to start asking more about it and start assessing whether you thought it was a legitimate unwanted pregnancy or an illegitimate unwanted pregnancy, how are you going to get to what the person's real reason is when you start asking them? Okay, there's a barrier here to what you can find out. And if you do start trying to legislate around it, then you get this kind of weird legal exception around a thought crime, right? Because the actus reus is the same, right? The abortion, the thing that actually happens physically in the world is the same. What you'd be criminalizing is the intention to do it, the nature of the intention to do it. And that's a weird legal thing, and it would point to a kind of inconsistency there in the law that would need lots of justification. So there's an issue here. There's a practical issue, as well as a kind of ideological one. More than that, feminism really prides itself, good feminism, if you ask me, really prides itself on being intersectional, okay? So overlapping with and taking into account other struggles. And more than that, offering solidarity to the most vulnerable members of our society. And and also feminism prides itself on valuing care in a world where care is undervalued, all right? And on providing care to one another in a world where care is undervalued. And feminism rejects biology as destiny, okay? All of these are violated when you start aborting on the basis of disability, okay? So there are lots of issues to consider there. And more to the point, and many of you will know this already, there are two models of disability. One of them is the medical model. This idea that it's something to do with a person's physical or mental limitations, and the way that we correct for that is by medical intervention, okay? We try to make the person normal as much as we can, using whatever interventions are necessary to do so. Another model, a model which I think is much more satisfying, is the social model, which is to say that disability results from people being disabled by their environments and by the attitudes of others, okay? And this is not to deny any physical difference, okay? It's just a better way of understanding it. So there are disabling environments that meet the needs of some of the people who interact with them, and there are non-inclusive social attitudes. And the way that this kind of model is kind of evidenced is by the fact that disabled people are less disabled in certain contexts than they are in others. The university that I worked at in Lebanon was totally non-accessible, okay? And I had a student midway through a course who broke her foot and realised this. She literally couldn't get to any of her classes. She needed to essentially be carried by people in order to get to the places that she needed to go, okay? That's not the case here, I hope, right? And so if it's that variable in terms of how normal a person can feel, then it has to be something to do with the environment that they're in as well. And then the solution is to improve awareness of the diversity of needs and to make environments more inclusive. And so when the medical establishment offers particular services in terms of screening and counselling around those services, it's upholding certain discriminatory norms about disability and diminishing our commitment as a society to reducing that marginalisation that people experience. So this is, and many feminists would identify with this social model. Again, we have that tension, okay? Good, okay. And so, how far can this pro-choice, given these kinds of issues and others, how far can this pro-choice model rhetoric take us? So, pro-choice, as I said before, is reacting to patriarchal control of female bodies, all right? By various different establishments, religion, state, husband, father, whatever it might have been historically, and all the various things that it is now. And this idea that women suspend their self-interest in favour of serving others. Okay, that's a gender norm. And so pro-choice reasserts a woman's exclusive right to decision-making capacity about how she uses her body. And it formulates reproduction as a kind of contingent and optional role of female bodies, even if female bodies are, given the technology we currently have, necessary for reproduction, if that makes sense. And so how far can we stretch this kind of rationale regarding choice? Well, the mandate comes from the right to non-interference, to start with, and the right to remain sexually active without life-changing consequences, right? Both of those seem like reasonable things. And what those things entail is the right to contraception and to abortion. So the positive right to not be pregnant, okay? So the positive right requires some kind of input. And the right to non-interference, the negative right to become pregnant, right? So no one interfering with that right, okay? But what we don't get out of that analysis is the right to a particular kind of child or pregnancy, okay? You need further motivations in order to make that come out. Okay, so you could approach this from two feminist positions. So the first one kind of reiterates what I just said in a way. So reproductive autonomy is a position that we adopt because female bodies are the only way of producing children, okay? Since those bodies belong to people who also have a right to sexual autonomy, they should be able to specify when they do not want their bodies to be used for producing children. And to be able to access the enabling resources to make that so. And then there's a second position, which is the same as the first position, with an additional bit which says that choice is a moral good, or a feminist moral good. And access to further decisions regarding the details of offspring should also be permitted. Okay, as I say, you need some independent motivation for that. I don't know what that would look like. But position two kind of emerges from this liberal third wave choice feminism. It goes by various different names, okay? Or gets called various different names, I guess. And it kind of fetishizes choice as being liberating. Though that choice, as far as I can tell, tends to be configured within really limited and stereotypical norms, okay? Without much critique. Before I get onto the second part of the talk, which I might not, then I'll talk a little bit more about that. Might there be other reasons as a feminist for wanting further choices about how you have a child? Well, one thing might be to reduce the rearing burden. This goes back to talking about disability. Maybe you want to say, look, I have all these things in my life and I want to have a child, but I want to also maintain many of these other things in my life, and so I want a specific kind of rearing burden rather than another kind of rearing burden, okay? Slightly dodgy view there, right? But that's the kind of thing that people say about these decisions. Person might want to delay reproduction in order to prioritise other projects, okay? Increasingly common, lots of people now freezing their eggs, right? So they can focus on career progression and then, do whatever later on. Outsourcing reproduction to others, okay? You need reproductive technologies to do this. There's a massive international and growing international trade in surrogates, right? So this idea of renting out another woman's womb, usually a poor woman of colour from the global south, right? But this is a booming industry, okay, for lots of different reasons. Reproducing in non-normative ways. Some people cannot have genetic children together without using reproductive technology. So, there's a role for them there as well. It might just be something as simple as optimal control over uses of body. Arguments need to be made for each of these, but I should have control over my body, right? In all the most optimal ways possible. I should have maximal control over my own body. One reason that, there's a big literature emerging on this, moral enhancement. So it might be that a feminist is concerned with selecting out violent or aggressive tendencies, right? And so wants to use selection tools in order to produce children who are more feminist or something. Who knows, right? I think they're all really bad reasons, frankly. Arguments can be made about all of them. I'm sure you can all see that, except perhaps reproducing in non-normative ways, which is a lot more complicated, right? But I'm not somebody who particularly thinks that having genetic children is all that important. I can understand why people position differently, might see that differently. But the rest of them, I don't think there are good arguments for them. I think they come across as patriarchal bargains again, right? So they come across as things which aren't necessarily serving broader feminist aims. There's a short-termism about them, and they're not exercising any real change within the social world. Okay. So what about choice more generally then? Is choice a moral good? Okay? Is choice something we should be pursuing? Maybe not just in the reproductive realm, but more generally. Should we all be going out there looking for choices? Would our lives be better if we had more choices? There's a question of positionality here. For some of us, we don't have many. Some of us don't have many choices, and some of us have lots of choices, right? So that has to be taken into account when you ask that question. But proliferating choices is generally assumed to be positive, especially within a kind of libertarian framework, right? The idea being that if A is your preferred option, okay, and then B becomes available as another option, you can still pick A, okay? So you're not worse off, right? You can still have what you preferred to start with, now you have another choice, right? So that seems better in some sense, okay? And so as I say, within a libertarian framework, this idea that a rational agent must prefer a greater number of choices. And it assumes that the availability of additional choices has no bearing whatsoever on the existing choices that you had to start with. So in the words of rules, people are not compelled to accept more if they do not wish to, nor does a person suffer from a greater liberty. Okay? So there's no problem with having more choices, but there would be a problem with having fewer, by that same logic. But there are lots of issues with choice, okay? And so, a few of them then. So, consumer psychology demonstrates there's a kind of tyranny of choice, right? So if you give people lots and lots of choices, they end up quite unhappy about it. Some of you will have heard about that ice cream experiment that they did a while ago, where they gave people lots of flavours of ice cream, or like 30 flavours of ice cream, or like 5 flavours of ice cream, and they asked them to pick flavour of ice cream and then asked them how happy they were with their choice. And those who picked from the 30 were very unhappy with their choice, and those who picked from 5 were pretty solidly happy with their choice, right? So, silly experiments, but, in a basic sense, choices are costly, okay? We live in a world now of lots of choices. If one of us is going to book a holiday this evening, it's going to take a long time to go through all the various different options for taking that holiday, okay? Can I get it cheaper? Which airline should I go with? It takes time. So there's a lot of research required. There's a big responsibility when you have to make a choice. And quite often there's a lot of regret once the choice is made, right? You wonder about the other choices that you weren't permitted to experience, the kind of counterfactual worlds. So that's the first thing. Second thing, choices are not independent. I'll talk about that on the next slide. Particularly in social contexts, when you add new choices, you modify the old ones. Okay? So it does change things. And thirdly, choice disguises these kind of mitigating factors about the social structures of our society. And so when you make a choice, it becomes your fault. It becomes your responsibility. If it goes wrong, it becomes your fault. Okay? So it individualizes a particular burden in kind of privatizing ways of doing things to the individual, right? You're in charge, you choose, you take responsibility for the thing that you choose. And one example of this as well is that, there's no need to provide assistance for additional needs if the parent in question, going back to the disability example, didn't choose to select against those additional needs. So you might say, well, look, you made a choice, okay? Now you deal with it. Why should we help you, okay? Why should we provide resources to help you with that? You made a choice. Prior to screening programs, that would likely, and I'm not saying that is how it is seen now, but who knows how things will be in the future, okay? So going back to that second point then, offering new options isn't just additive, okay? So it's not simply the case that you just add more things and you end up with more things, all right? It reconfigures the possibility space completely and modifies the nature of the options that you had to start with. In some cases, even to the extent where a choice that was a choice beforehand, when new choices come in, is simply no longer a choice that you could legitimately make in terms of social norms, all right? And you often can't predict or control how that's going to turn out. So some examples, these are Gerald Dawkins examples. Co-ed accommodation, so mixed accommodation, right? So it was historically the case in universities that you would have kind of binarized accommodation, right? So you'd have accommodation for girls and accommodation for boys. And then when co-ed accommodation came in, you were given a choice. Do you want to live in the co-ed accommodation or do you want to live in, the old accommodation? And that's not as simple as it sounds, right? Because if you then decide that you're going to live in the co-ed accommodation, that might be seen as a commitment to a particular kind of lifestyle, right? If you were, and the old choice of living in the, kind of binarized accommodation might be seen as, you being a bit kind of stuffy and old-fashioned and in a way that before you just lived there, right? And then suddenly you have to make this choice. So there are various things associated with it. Dueling, okay? So this idea of fighting with someone to the death over a particular dispute. Making that illegal removes the social pressure for people to feel that they had to do that, right? And so it reconfigures the choices that you have if something becomes illegal. Equally, inheritance of wealth. Suppose that we made inheritance of wealth illegal. Suppose it was illegal and then we made it legal, right? So you can inherit wealth. People who had been planning on spending all their own money on themselves, because they may have thought, I earned the money, why don't I spend it? Suddenly appears selfish when there's the option of passing it down to your children, right? So things look different suddenly. And also things like the expansion of infrastructure around vehicles, around cars, okay, has completely changed public transport options, particularly in the US. There's an assumption that people will get there by car, right? Examples abound on this. The one that kind of stands out to me, because where's my phone? Because I have a phone like this, is that nowadays you can have a phone like this, but you can also have a phone like that one, right? Or like the one which everybody else here probably has. And fine, it feels like a choice, right? You pick your phone. Except that now that everybody has phones like that, people can just change plans at the last minute and I have no idea where I'm going, right? So it's changed the norms quite considerably so that I can no longer sort of comfortably exist in our social world where people will make a plan with me and I'll be there on time and I have no way of working out where the new place is, right? So new choices change things. Okay, and more than that, spurning options can also be a way of kind of asserting something important, right? So being kind of monogamous, for example, not eating meat, all right? So all of these things can kind of have social dimensions which aren't immediately obvious. Okay, and so this libertarian paradigm presumes that choice itself can't be a source of harm. All right, but choice underwrites consumer capitalism, as we know, right? And so the logic of consumer capitalism relies on the inherent value of choice. And increased choices, there are so many, in terms of the phones, there are so many different phones that you can have now, right? They essentially do the same thing, but there are so many choices. And what that does is it produces redundancies, right? You've got competition between various different companies. You've got things being produced which aren't necessarily going to be used. You've got huge, huge amounts of products being made. And that correlates with the diversion and depletion of natural resources, for example, which causes a reduction of choice in some other context, which may be very far away, or it might be very, distant in terms of in the future, okay? But the idea is that every time you update your contract and get a new phone, you're using rare minerals from Central Africa, and your phone, once you give it up, the old one is probably ending up in Nigeria or Ghana on some dump where someone's going to pick apart all the pieces and burn it off and live till 33 because they get some rare cancer, right? So I mean, these are choices which we're making, but they're obviously choices which are causing the reduction of choices in other parts of the world. And more than that, this choice paradigm is deployed often within a very inflexible ideological domain. The choices which we have under capitalism are extremely limited, right? It feels like we've got loads of choices, and that's the argument that's often made against communism, for example, right? We'd all have to wear the same thing, and we'd all have to drive the same car if we even have cars. This idea that we have all these choices under capitalism, right? We don't really have many choices at all. We just have choices within particular pockets, right? We have choices about products and services, essentially. And so you might end up significantly changing the ideology and having fewer choices in some domains and more choices about what you do with your spare time or how much you want to have, for example. So it's not as simple as choice is more complex than it seems at first sight, is the bottom line there. And so the proliferation of reproductive choices completely reconfigures the possibility space regarding procreation. All right? So this is going back to the original point again. So what began as an action and an inaction, or a negation of an action, it multiplies, but only within one pole of the kind of possibility space, if that makes sense, right? In the same way that products do as well. You can start out by saying, I don't want a phone, and then when there's only 3 phones on offer, and when there are 500 phones on offer, it seems a bit harder to say, I don't want one, there are so many now. And in much the same way, there's a kind of multiplying of possibilities. Maybe you didn't want a child, right? But now you can choose what kind of child you have, right? Maybe you're worried about the risks of this or the risks of that. Well, you can choose, okay? And so it sort of removes excuses, as it were. And I think feminists should be wary of the multiplying of possibilities which are centred on more productive and more profitable uses of the female body, okay? And that's what seems to be happening here. And so as more options appear on the side of choosing to procreate, as I say, you're removing excuses from the other side, from the people who say, well, I don't want to have a child because of such and such. And that, coupled with this very, very strong kind of pronatalist social norm that we have, increases a coercion to reproduce, right? Which is something that feminists have been resisting historically. So although these reproductive technologies have given women greater control over their own bodies, as a general rule, there are lots of other things to consider. The first one is that the government, the medical establishment, and the booming pharmaceutical industry also now have greater control over women's bodies, okay? As I've said before, new norms are being produced, and old norms, i.e. the norm of a female body procreating, are being reinforced through these technologies. It's also worrying that there's a relative lack of progress in other domains in terms of other things that women may need, all right? It's been enormous technological advances in having babies, right? But there are all sorts of other demands that people make where there have been almost no advances at all. Genetic determinism is legitimised. The more we keep focusing on this genetic world as being so important, we're entrenching the idea that we are our genes. And more than that, all of these developments easily dovetail with consumer capitalism. There are huge markets in these things now. Okay. And so what's the answer then? So going back to one of the arguments at the beginning, thinking about virtuous parenting. Okay, what does it mean to be a good parent? There's an excellent paper by McDougall where she says, So she's kind of setting up a basic virtue ethics position, criterion of right action, and action is right if and only if it's what a virtuous agent would do in the circumstances. That's how we set up virtue ethics. And how do we decide on which virtues we're interested in? Well, they're virtues that are character traits conducive to human flourishing based on immutable facts about human life. Okay? Well, it doesn't get, more immutable as a feature of human life than the uncertainty of human life. Okay? The idea that we just can't predict how people will turn out, the sorts of decisions that people will make. And so in our own lives and in the lives of others, we inevitably encounter situations that we cannot control and that we cannot change, despite our best efforts to do so. And so, there's a huge plurality of people and ideas in the world in which we live. And so exercising tolerance with regard to others and being prepared to accept whatever may come your way, particularly in a child, seems like a key virtue for human flourishing in what is a quickly changing world. And so McDougall says that intending to select the features of your offspring means you are not acting parentally. Okay, so this is key. It's the key feature of being a parent, and you are not acting like a parent. All right. So acceptance is a core ethical value for parents because it's key to the flourishing of children. And so if you're committed to bringing another person into our moral community, then you should also be committed to an openness about the future of that autonomous moral agent that you are bringing into the community. Okay? And since you will only ever be able to control certain aspects of that, it is better to be accepting. Besides the fact that the choices that we make in this regard, in terms of genetic selection, can only be as good as the genetic determinism which they're founded on, right? So if we think genetic determinism is a flawed idea, then it makes no sense to kind of build so much on it. The social structures in our society and the accidental features of our characters as well are so much more determinative of the people that we turn out to be. And so the idea here is that we resist this right to choice, and instead kind of all commit to being accepting and to being tolerant of however things turn out. Okay. And something that needs to be thrown in here, of course, is that we're looking at this tension again. The abortions for bodily autonomy, or abortions for weak eugenics, okay? Or abortions for mere preference, just for the novelty of being able to choose, right? And there's that tension there, which is at the centre of all of this. What we have to remember when we have these discussions is abortion is a biopolitical gatekeeper, okay? Abortions decide who gets to come into the world and who doesn't. And so there's an enormous potential for abuse there, all right? There's a social control that's being enacted right at the level of existence, of who gets to exist. And that kind of gatekeeping is very much in the hands of science, on the one hand, because that's how we get the information about fetuses and what their various different features are. And also whatever, the clinical procedures that are legal, that the government decides are legal, all right? And so a question which I won't answer, but I'll leave kind of outstanding is, or to an extent outstanding, is do women have a right to know? Is that part of realising the right to bodily autonomy? Okay? Do women have a right to know the sex of the fetus? Do they have a right to know anything more about it? Who does that information belong to? And if science permits us to have it, ought a woman to have it? Right, to have that information. What we can consider is kind of two things here that seem important. One is that owners of female bodies have exclusive sovereignty over the reproductive domain. That's a kind of comes from the, as I say, the fact that as technology stands, we can't have children any other way. But also a commitment to the virtue of accepting others as a way of promoting human flourishing in the face of insoluble uncertainty. All right, so trying to maintain those two positions at once. So accordingly, what we could do is support contraception and abortion as enabling conditions for realising bodily autonomy, so the right not to be pregnant, okay? But withhold support for other non-medical reproductive choices. And what that would mean is that non-medical prenatal selection would be avoided, but also that the information which precedes those decisions should perhaps also not be offered or not be requested, depending on what side of that you're on, okay, whether you're a doctor or whether you're a patient. How you enact that, I don't know. But refusing to know what has been socially constructed to hurt people, in a way, and refusing to kind of make choices within such a limited domain where the power, the power that sets up that domain is very much outside it, seems like a form of feminist resistance in this case, okay? A kind of willful ignorance practiced as a feminist virtue. And I can either stop there, or should I stop there?
Yeah,
okay.
It's great. Yeah.
Thank you for listening.
Okay, thanks very much, Arianne. It's really great. But yeah, just to give us time for questions.
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
I don't know if there's a curfew. Okay, so comments are welcome as well as questions, but if you make comments, they have to be brilliant, okay? Questions, you can, any questions, great. So, okay, we've got a question already, yeah?
I just want to first off say thank you very much for that. I found it very informative and very intriguing. It's been a subject I've been facing for quite a while, and this was very useful. I was just looking at the, thinking about the libertarian approach, that initially would be pro-choice. But surely wouldn't libertarianism also teach pro-responsibility? So like, if the woman had unprotected and even maybe even protected, as there is a chance obviously, to have sex, wouldn't a libertarian who was quite emphasised pro responsibility, say that the woman ought to carry out the pregnancy as, in my opinion, in my judgment and opinion, that abortion kind of does infringe the rights. I mean, I'm still quite unsettled about this. I'm not in any particular camp. It's like almost, we all have the right to eat a lot of chocolate and junk food, but but like. It's not. You can't really say we also have the right not to be obese as a consequence. It's kind of apple and oranges, but would you think that's a fair thing to say?
I do, yeah, and there's a spectrum here, I guess. You get a range of libertarian views within the literature on this specific topic, some of which kind of have this view that whatever is available out there in terms of technology ought to be yours, even to the extent that, we always paint designer babies as this horrible slippery slope argument, like nobody wants designer babies. There are lots of kind of libertarian scholars out there who are like, yes, we want designer babies. Why shouldn't we have designer babies? We've got the technology. It doesn't belong to the medical establishment. It belongs to us. It belongs to all of us, and we should have the access to that, right? And then take the responsibility for whatever comes out. But on the other hand, you've also got those writing who, as you say, are kind of claiming, you made certain decisions, various responsibilities follow from that, and you ought to see them through. I guess from a feminist perspective, obviously, that responsibility is not shared, right? So there's a strong gendered component to that responsibility. So if you're somebody who's looking at it from a kind of feminist libertarian perspective, you'd still be saying, wait a second, these people engaged in this thing, and one person has all these consequences, and the other person doesn't necessarily have quite the same, So you might want to use that as a kind of mitigating factor. But there is a spectrum of views on this, in terms of, when do you start taking responsibility? Is it responsibility without any interventions, or do you get some intervention and then you take responsibility thereafter, right? Do you see what I mean? It could be at any point along that kind of causal chain, and I think arguments can be made as I say, at any point from that perspective.
Okay, I've got a question at the back. Also, you can notify me while other people are talking. If you have a question, just raise your hand and I'll write it down and create a list. But yeah, at the back.
Thanks very much. It was really interesting. I just wondered, you didn't talk very much about the responsibility of medical practitioners. And, in a situation where you are refusing information, you are often made to feel extremely bad about it.
Yeah.
So if that is to be strategy, then there would have to be quite a lot of re-education of medical practitioners. So
Yeah, absolutely. Are you a medical practitioner?
no, I've been in a position of
Refusing
to have that
information.
information.
Okay.
previously.
Right, sure.
As a protester, I would not accept any type of fake.
Right, absolutely.
And was made to feel very bad about it. So I just think there is a long way to go on that.
Okay, so your question was not medical practitioners being made to feel bad about refusing to give information, but patients being made to feel bad about refusing to accept screening, for example.
Yeah, the education of medical practitioners to allow women to refuse testing, etc. And medical intervention.
Right, and this goes back to this openness, right? To this tolerance and openness about whatever comes. And again, there is a literature on this. There are people who are writing fantastic stuff on, women who have refused various forms of screening, kind of talking about, and that having ended in various different ways, kind of talking about their experiences of it. In terms of, I think it does work the other way around though, in terms of what I thought you were saying originally, which is medical practitioners. I mean, you can imagine if you went to see a doctor and you had an ultrasound scan and you wanted to know the sex of the fetus, and the doctor said, "I'm sorry, I find that really sexist, actually, I'm not going to tell you," And obviously, ultrasound scans, who can really tell what's going on? So even if you were looking at the screen, people always say that's the head or whatever, and you don't really know, it doesn't look like a head, does it? So, you wouldn't be able to tell yourself, and certainly in early scans, I guess. So, so from that perspective, you can imagine there would be, withdrawing something that's been so widely available. They've actually made it illegal in India. They've made it illegal in India, sex determination during pregnancy, because there's such a big issue with sex selection there. But I think what's interesting to think about in this regard is eye colour, for example, right? Which presumably can be relatively easily determined from a genetic test. But most of us would agree that's not okay. So probably, if you take a sample of an ordinary group of people, they would probably say, well, sex of the child, yeah, I'd like to know that. And the reasons people give actually are kind of strange, because people often say things like, I want to know what colour to paint the room, for example. And really the reasons don't get any better than that, certainly, right? I need to think about a name, and it's kind of like, you could probably do a little bit more thinking, couldn't you? And it wouldn't be... But eye colour, most people would say no, that's not, I don't think people should be able to know that, right? So in terms of where would people be happy to draw the line at information, I think if gender was less important in the society in which we live, then people would probably be less keen to know in that regard. So from the doctor's perspective, certainly the social world would have to change in order for that doctor-patient relationship to sort of survive changes in how much information is given. But yeah, in terms of what the patient how the patient responds to that, there are huge campaigns within the disabled community, in terms of even offering the screening. As I said, it's insulting, it's insulting to be offering this screening, and doctors, I suppose, can be quite sort of, they're not an especially political bunch to start with, right? And I think you can kind of, there's a lot of pragmatism that goes on within the medical profession, and obviously the direction that the NHS is going in is very much, about saving money and, privatisation and all the rest of it. And in that regard, that economic argument in terms of the cost of medical care over the course of a lifetime as opposed to doing some screening, I think that's the position that they're thinking about it from. But it is incredibly demeaning, both to an existing marginalised community and to the prospective parent who they're talking to, as though that parent will be desperate to know that, right? And as though that's going to necessarily change how they think about, their child. So, no, it's a very interesting question though, and I think more discussions need to be take place in those rooms with medical professionals.
Okay, at the back. Please.
Yes, so considering that we're sort of saying that abortion is like a kind of feminist imperative, and a lot of these problems are basically being created by society, like support for basically being disabled and stuff. But then also considering that in places like India, sex-selective abortions are still happening even though they're illegal. And that's creating all of the sort of associated problems with illegal abortion. Isn't it, in one respect, important that these services are still available to women that want them? Because otherwise, you can stop offering these things, but there'll still be people on the internet who could be saying that they'll do it or pretending to do it or something like that, which would be basically causing other.
Yeah, and this was part of the reason, feminist campaigners in this country, when Fiona Bruce tried to push through that bill, that was their reason. They were like, these women who you are targeting, who are not, it's not a huge group of women to start with, but many of them are feeling very, very strong pressures within their community, for all sorts of reasons, that they have to have a son, and they are going to, they're going to do whatever it takes, basically. Or they're going to be under enormous pressure, they're going to be stressed, it could cause mental health issues. Because the way that abortion provision works in this country, so when I talked about a de facto kind of anyone can have an abortion sort of thing, we all know that's not actually the case. And what is the case is that you have to prove that there will be distress were the person forced to carry the fetus to full term, right? And in this case, it qualifies, right? It causes distress, right? This person is in a community where, it could be something as kind of straightforward as dowry payment, right? So the cost of a dowry payment, which might bankrupt a family. It seems completely rational then to not want to have a daughter, right? So there are tremendous pressures. It's not easy in that regard. And even though in India now your sex determination is not legal, as you say, how on earth do you regulate this, right? It's so easy to determine the sex of the fetus, and obviously it will be happening. This issue has not just resolved when the law changed; it's still happening. Clearly, social change needs to come first, and that was again what people were saying when they were kind of combating Fiona Bruce's bill, was that this, you can't do this, you can't push this through before we have the kind of social world that will accept that, right? That's the wrong way round. We need to start campaigning, because a lot of people were like, of course, it's not great, is it, if you're killing female fetuses? That's not something we celebrate. But we have to look at why people are doing this, right, and what the broader social things are. So it's difficult. I don't have a better answer than that, I'm afraid. But it is really, really tricky. And the last thing you want is to be marginalising people who already feel like they're under tremendous amounts of pressure, right? And that's why I'm glad that the bill didn't go through in the end.
Okay, at the front.
Thanks for the really interesting talk. I have a question which I don't really know what I think about, and I would like to hear your thoughts regarding sharing choice between the two parents of the fetus.
Yep.
A lot of people, particularly fathers of unborn children, would bring up the case of why doesn't the father have a say in it as well. And the obvious argument is that because biologically pregnancy takes place in a woman's body, she has bodily autonomy, so therefore the choice is entirely hers. And that makes sense to me and is much better to me than the other option. But it doesn't sit 100% correctly with me, comfortably even with me, because isn't that kind of biologically deterministic, and isn't feminism about kind of making equality where biologically, I don't know how, do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I do know. I think I do know what you
Like,
mean. Yeah.
because the argument of, well, tough, it just happens to be that way biologically, so therefore that's how it is. That argument could be used in the other kind of side of saying, well, it's a woman's responsibility to have children because that's just the way biology is so tough, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So can you reconcile that, or is there always just going to be a discrepancy there?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. I mean, it cuts right to the heart of all of this stuff, and, I didn't talk about it at all. So it's kind of, it's a biological feature, it's kind of a contingent biological feature, it's something that we have to kind of work around as feminists, right? It's one of those kind of, technology hasn't permitted us to get around. I think there's a talk actually later in this series that's going to be precisely on that, right? So technologies around reproduction and whether we can reach a stage where it no longer has to be that's a biological reality. It's not quite the same as saying it's biologically deterministic. We tend to talk about biological determinism when we're moving from, say, when we're talking about the genetic world influencing the biological world, as it were, and then there are controversies there. There's no controversy really about the fact that, at the moment, in order to reproduce, in order to have a child, because you can adopt, but in order to reproduce, you need a female body in order to do that, right? That's not the only reason why we kind of think that it's important. I mean, it's a huge reason why we think it's important that women should be the primary decision makers around abortion. Now, obviously, I hope that if people here are in relationships that they are making decisions together and that they feel that they can and that there isn't a disagreement, which means that, well, you have to weigh up who gets primacy over that decision and who doesn't, right? I would hope that's the case. Obviously, that's not the case for lots of people. And I do think it then becomes, the decision of the person with the female body. But it's not only because of the female body, it's because we also live in a social world where the responsibility for raising children falls on women disproportionately, right? So, and obviously that's linked to the fact, to the whole female body thing in all sorts of complicated ways. But there's a biological reality about the actual consequences biologically for that person, not for the other person. But there's also a social reality about what you can expect once the child comes into life. And again, we hope, we wish it wasn't like that, of course, right? But we all know that there are, even in 2016, tremendous pressures on women as regards bringing up children, right? And even if people's reality within the private world of their relationship is equitable, the world outside judges, right? And that has to be factored in too. An interesting discussion that comes out of that is about contraception, right? And who takes, because you also said responsibility for, shouldn't it just be the woman's responsibility in that regard? And yeah, there's lots of interesting stuff coming up about, you may have heard that there are new breakthroughs in terms of a contraceptive, a male contraceptive, essentially, right? Now, why that's taken so long, I don't know, right? But then you hear all these discussions where people are like, oh, well, I wouldn't trust a man to do that because he doesn't have the consequences to worry about, right? Now, of course, in the eyes of the law, there are consequences to worry about, right? In terms of child support and all the rest of it, right? And I'd hope that people are better than that in any case, as it were. But yeah, that's definitely a domain where really important discussions have to be had, because almost nobody, for the last few decades has questioned the fact that, going back to causal change, you can interrupt that causal chain at a much earlier point, right? So that it's just not possible for a pregnancy to occur at a point that's earlier than the woman's body, right? So, that's an important discussion. And the scientific breakthroughs there are really exciting at the moment, actually.
Okay, I've got Hugo first, sorry.
I guess I wanted to kind of look more at this seems cold, but like the financial side of this, because this is kind of connected to the last question, but there is, and it's kind of connected to the question earlier where you referenced dowries in India. It seems that there are financial requirements that are necessary to raise to raise a child under certain circumstances, be that disability or gender in India, or and I think it sucks, but I also think it's kind of the reality of the situation. And there are some countries where something like adoption or putting a child up to adoption is possible, or having support for a disabled child. But I'd say there are many, many more countries where that is just not possible. So I feel like there's a conflict there.
Yeah, absolutely, and then pragmatic decisions are made, right? And I mean, we're talking about, in many cases, people whose quality of life and whose financial means is, probably not great, and an additional burden on that is absolutely life-changing, right? In a way that is unthinkable for most of us. So yeah, I mean, that goes back to the other question. I mean, it's a pragmatic concern. It's not one we can ignore, and a kind of fully intersectional feminism should be taking these things into account, right? People are variably positioned economically. These decisions mean different things for different people. Somebody who, needs another labourer for their farm and lives in a community where it would be completely socially alienating to put their daughter out as a labourer on the farm, right, is making a particular kind of decision, and that's a very different decision to a couple who have 3 daughters in kind of a global north country and want a son because it would be quite fun to have a son because they've had a go at raising some daughters and now they want a son. That's a really different situation, and I think putting them all together and saying this nobody should be allowed to do this is obviously doesn't recognise that when we're not all positioned in the same way in this world, right? And it's important to point that stuff out. It's not cold at all. It's incredibly warm in a way because it's kind of embracing the differences that
So
did you want to?
Following that logic along, does that mean that we should give more choice to, for example, a single mother who has to both raise and support financially their child?
Yeah.
Or does that mean that there should be some connection to the father if the father is the one supporting financially?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, as impractical or as far away as we are from this, and certainly in particular countries, I do think this is the state's responsibility to step in, and I think we have to, the society's responsibility to step in, I think, we have all sorts of odd arrangements around parenting and parental leave and, and I think we need to look very closely at how we support parents, at how we support children, at how we embrace difference and make people, kind of feel welcome and supported and all the rest of it. I think that's a sort of collective social responsibility rather than it being, you got pregnant, your responsibility, or, you've made this. I think that individualising of it is very, very odd because ultimately that child is going to live with those people maybe for some period of time and then be a person in the world on their own to a certain extent, right? They belong to a community rather than simply to a family that has to then take sole responsibility for them. And I think kind of moving towards a model where we devote social resources towards helping people to parent. As I say, that seems very, very far away, right? Even in this country, that seems very, very far away. But rather than having different levels of acceptability for things that can be quite heinous in some cases is, I think that would be the wrong approach. I think the right approach would be to kind of level things out at the social level.
Okay, great stuff.
Not my main question, but in response briefly on this topic, it gets even more complicated when we're talking about fertilized embryos. Like there was a celebrity case you recently might have heard of, where this whole equation, the woman's body isn't really an equation, so there's a surrogate, but I think it was what's her name? I can't remember where that's. But there, the man and woman are equal because she, I think, didn't want him when they broke up to have the first embryos. He really did because it was kind of his last chance to become a father or something like that.
Sure. Yeah.
That's not sort of rambling. And also with surrogacy, as you mentioned, it's capitalistic. Gone. Yeah, really abusive basically. My main question was it fair to blame feminism for this whole choice, Western, little bit white feminism epidemic, because obviously it's like, personally I hate it, I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah.
But it's kind of happening in lots of other movements. Like, it's generally sort of a capitalistic Western privilege problem. Maybe.
Yeah,
you see
absolutely.
Yeah, and is that fair?
Yeah, and I have to apologise if it came across as blaming feminism in any way, right? Because the second part of the talk, which I was amazingly, I've essentially written 2 talks, and one was going to come after this and talk about choice feminism, essentially, which isn't feminism; it's a form of feminism, right? And as you say, that's happening within other movements too. The kind of distinction I was going to make was between choice feminism and something called political feminism. It's not the best terminology, but this idea that there's a reason. Feminism has kind of gone through a phase of not having many friends, right? And kind of addressing its popularity problem by making it the case that anyone can be a feminist, regardless of what choices they make, right? But that's a particular form of feminism. It's a particular kind of new incarnation of feminism that fits very well with capitalism, right? In the sense of you can have what you want. It fits in with various different markets, and it's been used by big corporations, right? So I think it's a particular form of feminism that fits really well with this idea that you should be able to choose everything and anything, and no one should be allowed to criticize your choices in the name of pluralism, right? That's a word that kind of gets co-opted by that choice feminism. We want kind of plurality here, so everything has to go, right? And that's like so ideologically light that it's not an ideology anymore, right?
What would you call that?
That view, I'd call it all sorts of things. Choice feminism, yeah. There are choice feminism, neoliberal feminism, lean-in feminism. Lean in. That Sheryl Sandberg, is that her name? Sheryl Sandberg. Her book Lean In kind of is right at the heart of all of this, right? Or kind of summarizes this position. This idea that you're responsible for your own choices. Now go out there and make them, right? And forget structural factors. They just don't matter, right? You're on your own. You're an agent out there in the world. Take what you want, and what you don't take is your own fault, right? It's this kind of, and it's extraordinary. It's coming from a place of real privilege, as you say, right? Because so many people out there have choices which are so limited and, frankly, pretty much predetermined. Where I went to school in, working class Essex, in a comprehensive school, nobody really had choices, right? Life was pretty much predetermined. I was a total exception in a way, but the kids I went to school with, I don't think at any point in their life have had a real choice that they've been able to make, right? And that's how most people in the world are, right? They don't make choices. They don't get to make choices. They think they're making choices when they're not making choices. And choice itself is really complicated anyway, right? Because even when people in positions of relative privilege make choices, are they really making choices? They're making choices within a particular ideology, right? Subject to particular pressures, So it's a tricky concept in and of itself, but what you're talking about is a very particular form of feminism. I don't think it should be, kind of the mainstream feminism. I think we need to reclaim mainstream feminism for what it is, which is, it's radical, it's really judgmental, and it excludes a lot of people, a lot of positions, a lot of different ways of thinking about things. And that's what feminism is, and it doesn't work for everybody. And that's the whole idea. Because if it did, then everything would be fine as it was, right? The idea is to change things. So I think, what I've been saying fits in with this choice feminism, not with,
Last point, I swear.
Yeah.
Could you call the opposite, maybe call it something really long, like intersectional, eco-feminist, being aware of consequences, non-just Western-centric?
Yeah.
What kind of
intersectional feminism would do that for you, right? Because the whole idea of intersectional feminism is that you're taking a whole load of different axes of oppression, right? As many as you can name. And in each decision that you make, in each ideological commitment that you make, you are taking all of those things into account. And that's going to mean that you have to look at the positionality of somebody necessarily, right? But it doesn't mean you don't get to critique, right? Once you get there, right? It just means that those things have to be taken into consideration. I don't think you end up with some really fine-grained thing where everybody's views go and everybody's right? That's the choice feminism outcome. I think you end up with seeing patterns of oppression, right? It doesn't take a genius to see that that's how our world works, right? And so I think you see things matching up, you see patterns emerging, and that's how you generate your feminism based on those patterns that you see emerging, right? And you always start from the bottom, as it were. You start from the place where most of those lines are crossing over. And you say that's where feminism begins, right? It begins with the person who needs it most. It begins where, you know, there is the greatest amount of intersection going on. So, you know, we start with export processing zones in Southeast Asia, for example, right? Where women are being exploited in sweatshops. That's where we start. We don't start by thinking about having, you know, 500 shades of lipstick as, you know, the choices that we want to have. We, you know, our feminism starts elsewhere, and the focus of it is there. So yeah, intersectional feminism would probably do what you want, and there's lots of it out there. I don't want to, you know, talk too negatively. You know, this is one particular view, and in the reproductive domain, this is the dominant view. You know, and many of the most vocal and visible feminists are speaking in ways that I think are quite sloppy about these issues, right?
Okay, we're out of time. So can we thank Arianne for a really